I grounded my son for lying, but what he was hiding was worse. My name is Michael, and I was born in Columbus, Ohio, where I learned from my parents that honesty was the foundation of everything. They taught me that lies, no matter how small, would always come back to hurt you. So when I caught my 12-year-old son, Danny, in what I thought was a clear, obvious lie, I did what any responsible parent would do. I grounded him. 2 weeks? No phone, no video games, no friends. I thought I was teaching him a lesson about integrity and trust. I thought I was being a good father. Please listen to my story and tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong, because I never imagined that punishing my son for dishonesty would lead me to uncover a secret so terrifying that it would change everything I thought I knew about keeping my family safe. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I came home from work earlier than usual because my boss had sent me home with a migraine that wouldn't quit. The house was quiet when I walked in, which seemed normal since my wife, Sarah, worked until 6, and Danny usually did his homework in his room after school. I grabbed some water and aspirin from the kitchen and headed upstairs to lie down. That's when I heard it. A voice coming from Danny's room. Not his voice, but someone else's. An adult male voice, muffled but definitely there. My stomach dropped. We had strict rules about having friends over when we weren't home, and we certainly never allowed adults in the house without our knowledge. I walked quickly down the hall and pushed Danny's door open without knocking. My son was sitting at his desk, his laptop open in front of him, and he jumped about a foot in the air when I entered. His face went pale, completely white like he'd seen a ghost. He slammed the laptop shut so fast that I heard the plastic crack. I asked him who he was talking to. He stammered and said nobody, that he was just watching a video for school. But I'd heard a conversation, back and forth dialogue, not a one-way video. I asked him again, and he stuck to his story. He was watching an educational video about the American Revolution. His history teacher had assigned it. He showed me his history homework sheet as proof, pointing to a question about the Continental Congress. Something felt wrong. The way he was sweating, the way his hands were shaking, the way he wouldn't make eye contact with me. But I didn't have concrete proof that he was lying, just a gut feeling, and the fact that I'd heard what sounded like a two-way conversation. I let it go for the moment, telling him I'd be checking with his teacher about that video assignment. He nodded quickly, too quickly, and said that was fine. Over the next few days, I watched him more carefully. Danny had always been a good kid. He got decent grades, had a small group of friends, played soccer on the weekends. He wasn't the type to get into serious trouble, but now he seemed nervous all the time. He'd check his phone constantly when he thought I wasn't looking, then quickly put it away if I entered the room. He started closing his bedroom door more often, which wasn't like him. He'd lock it sometimes, and when I'd knock, there would be a pause, a long pause, before he'd open it. Sarah noticed the change too. She asked me if something had happened at school, if maybe Danny was being bullied or having trouble with his friends. I told her about the incident with the laptop, and she agreed it was suspicious, but she thought maybe he was just talking to a friend online and was embarrassed about it. She said 12-year-old boys were weird about their privacy, that it was probably nothing serious. I wanted to believe her, but something in my gut kept nagging at me. Then came the lie I couldn't ignore. It was a Friday afternoon, and I was working from home. Sarah had taken the day off to visit her sister in Cleveland, about 2 hours away. Danny had asked that morning if he could go to his friend Tyler's house after school. I said yes, as long as Tyler's parents were home. He promised they would be. He said Tyler's mom had the day off and would be there the whole time. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to call Tyler's house to check in just to make sure everything was okay. Tyler's mom answered, and she sounded confused when I asked how the boys were doing. She told me Tyler wasn't home. He was at soccer practice and wouldn't be back until 6. She said Danny wasn't there either. She hadn't seen Danny in over a week. My heart started racing. I thanked her and hung up. I immediately called Danny's cell phone. It rang 4 times before he answered, and I could hear wind in the background like he was outside. I asked him where he was, and he said he was at Tyler's house. I told him I'd just spoken to Tyler's mom, and Tyler was at soccer practice. There was silence on the other end. Long, heavy silence. Then he started to talk fast. He said he'd gotten confused, that he meant he was at a different friend's house, Jake's house. He was at Jake's house, not Tyler's. I asked why he'd lied about Tyler, and he said he didn't lie. He just got mixed up. But his voice was shaking, and I could tell he was making it up as he went along. I told him to come home immediately. He said he would. He said he'd be home in 20 minutes. It took him 45 minutes to get home. When he walked in the door, his face was flushed, and he was breathing hard, like he'd been running. His shoes were muddy, which was strange because it hadn't rained in days and our neighborhood streets were clean. I asked him where he'd really been. He stuck to the Jake story. I told him I was going to call Jake's parents to verify, and he panicked. He said Jake's parents weren't home, that he'd been hanging out in Jake's backyard by himself, waiting for Jake to get back from an appointment. That was it. That was the moment I knew without a doubt that my son was lying to me. The stories didn't add up. The details kept changing, and he couldn't keep his facts straight. I told him he was grounded. 2 weeks, no phone, no computer, no leaving the house except for school. He would come straight home every day, do his homework at the kitchen table where I could see him, and spend his evenings in his room with nothing but books. I expected him to argue. I expected him to get angry or upset or defensive. That's what kids do when they get caught in a lie and face consequences. But Danny didn't do any of those things. Instead, his eyes filled with tears, and he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was fear. Pure, genuine fear. He asked me if he could please just explain, if he could tell me the truth about where he'd been, but I was too angry. I'd given him multiple chances, to be honest, and he'd lied to me over and over again. I told him the grounding stood, that lying had consequences, and that maybe 2 weeks without privileges would teach him the value of honesty. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something else, but then closed it. He nodded slowly, handed me his phone, and went upstairs to his room. That night at dinner, Danny barely touched his food. Sarah had come home by then, and I'd filled her in on everything that had happened. She agreed that grounding him was appropriate, but she seemed worried too. She kept looking at Danny with concern, asking him if he was feeling okay, if something was bothering him. He just said he was fine, that he was tired, and asked if he could be excused to go to bed early. The next morning was Saturday. Usually on Saturdays, Danny would sleep in until 9 or 10, then spend the morning watching cartoons or playing video games. But that morning I heard him up at 6. I went to check on him and found him sitting on his bed, fully dressed, staring at the wall. I asked him what he was doing up so early. He said he couldn't sleep. I asked him if he wanted to talk about anything, and he shook his head. Over the next few days, his behavior got stranger. He was jumpy, constantly looking over his shoulder. He'd flinch at sudden sounds. He stopped eating much at all, just picking at his meals. The dark circles under his eyes got worse, like he wasn't sleeping. Sarah and I started arguing about whether the grounding was too harsh, whether something else was going on. She wanted to lift the punishment and have a calm conversation with him. I insisted that we needed to follow through, that giving in would teach him that lying had no real consequences. On Wednesday, 5 days into the grounding, I was working in my home office when I heard a sound from Danny's room. It was muffled, but it sounded like crying. I got up and walked down the hall, pressing my ear to his door. He was definitely crying, but he was also talking to himself, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. I knocked and asked if I could come in. The crying stopped immediately, and after a moment he said yes. When I opened the door, Danny was sitting on his bed with his knees pulled up to his chest. His face was red and streaked with tears. I sat down next to him and put my hand on his shoulder, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I really looked at my son. Really looked at him. And what I saw scared me. He looked exhausted. He looked terrified. He looked like a child carrying a weight far too heavy for his small shoulders. I told him the grounding wasn't worth this, that whatever was going on, we could work through it together. I told him he could tell me anything, that I wouldn't be angry. I just needed to understand. And that's when he finally broke. He started sobbing, huge gasping sobs that shook his whole body. He said he wanted to tell me, that he'd wanted to tell me from the very beginning, but he was too scared. He said someone had told him that if he said anything, something terrible would happen. My blood ran cold. I asked him what he meant, who had told him that. He said he couldn't say. I told him he could tell me anything, that nothing was more important than his safety. He looked up at me with those tear-filled eyes and asked me if I promised I wouldn't get mad. I promised. I told him that whatever it was, we would handle it together. And then my 12-year-old son told me something that made my entire world tilt on its axis. He told me that a man had been contacting him online for the past 6 weeks. It started in a video game chat. The man seemed nice at first, asking about school and hobbies and soccer. Then he started asking more personal questions. Where Danny lived, what his parents did for work, when we were home and when we weren't. Danny said he didn't think anything of it at first because the man said he was a youth soccer coach looking for talented players for a travel team. But then the man started asking Danny to send pictures, just regular pictures at first, photos of Danny in his soccer uniform or doing homework. Then the requests got worse. The man asked for pictures without a shirt, pictures in the bathroom. The man told Danny that this was normal, that all the boys on the travel team had to do it, that it was part of the tryout process. Danny said he felt uncomfortable, but he really wanted to make the travel team, so he sent a few pictures. I felt sick, physically sick. My hands were shaking and my vision was blurring, and all I could think was that this couldn't be happening, not to my son, not in my house. I asked Danny if he'd met this man in person. He nodded. He said that was where he'd really been that Friday afternoon when he'd lied about going to Tyler's house. The man had asked him to meet at a park 3 miles from our neighborhood. He said he needed to see Danny in person to evaluate his soccer skills for the team. Danny rode his bike to the park. The man was there, waiting by the playground. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with gray hair and glasses. He seemed normal, Danny said. He seemed safe. They talked for about 20 minutes. The man asked Danny more questions, told him he was definitely talented enough for the travel team, said they'd be in touch about practices starting soon. Then just before Danny left, the man said something that made Danny's stomach hurt. He told Danny not to mention their meeting to his parents yet, because the travel team spots were supposed to be a surprise, a special announcement that would come later. He said if Danny told anyone, he'd lose his spot on the team. Danny rode home feeling confused. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. When I called him and confronted him about lying, he'd panicked. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't tell me the truth, because then he'd lose the travel team spot. But he couldn't keep lying, because he knew it was wrong. So he made up the story about Jake's house, hoping it would be enough. After I'd grounded him, Danny said the man contacted him again that same night. He messaged Danny on the video game platform, asking how the meeting went with his parents. When Danny explained that he'd lied and gotten in trouble, the man's tone changed. He told Danny that he'd made a big mistake, that lying to parents was serious. He said that if Danny told me or Sarah the truth now, the man would make sure everyone knew what Danny had done. He'd share the pictures Danny had sent. He'd tell Danny's school, his friends, his soccer team. He'd ruin Danny's life. That was why Danny had been so scared. That was why he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. He was trapped between the grounding and the threat, terrified of what would happen if the truth came out, but equally terrified of keeping the secret any longer. He said he'd been trying to figure out a way to fix everything on his own, but he didn't know how. He was just a kid, and this was so much bigger than anything he knew how to handle. I pulled my son into my arms and held him while he cried. I told him he'd done nothing wrong, that none of this was his fault. I told him he was incredibly brave for telling me, and that we were going to fix this together. I asked him if he still had the messages from the man, and he nodded. He said they were on his laptop and his phone, both of which I'd taken away when I grounded him. I immediately lifted the grounding. I told Danny he wasn't in trouble, that he'd never been in trouble, that the only person who was in trouble was the man who'd been manipulating him. I called Sarah at work and told her she needed to come home right away, that it was an emergency. When she asked what was wrong, I told her I'd explain when she got there. Then I retrieved Danny's laptop and phone from where I'd locked them in my office desk. The messages were all there, weeks and weeks of conversations. The man's profile name was something generic, Coach Mike 47, and his avatar was a stock photo of a soccer ball. He'd been careful, Danny said. He never used his real name, never gave specific details about where he lived or worked. But he'd asked Danny for plenty of details. Our address, our phone numbers, photos of our house. Danny had sent some of that information before he realized something was wrong. When Sarah got home and I explained everything, she went pale. She sat down next to Danny and held him while I pulled up the messages on his laptop. We read through them together, and with every message, Sarah's grip on Danny got tighter. The manipulation was obvious now that we knew what to look for. The man had groomed Danny slowly, building trust, then exploiting it. He'd isolated Danny by making him keep secrets. He'd used the promise of something Danny wanted, a spot on a travel team to get compliance. And then he'd used fear and shame to keep Danny quiet. Now this is where I did immediately contact law enforcement and tell Danny the grounding was completely lifted, that I want you to advise me if I was right or wrong. I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I called the local police department and told them my son had been contacted by a potential predator online. They sent 2 officers to our house within 30 minutes. A detective from the cybercrime unit called me an hour later and asked us to bring Danny's laptop and phone to the station the next morning. Sarah thought we should wait. Maybe talk to a lawyer first, make sure we understood the process. She was worried about how this would affect Danny, whether he'd have to testify, whether his name would become public. She wanted to protect him from more trauma. But I felt like every minute we waited was a minute this man could be contacting another child. grooming another victim. I couldn't live with myself if we stayed silent and someone else got hurt. We went to the police station Thursday morning. Danny was nervous, but the detective who interviewed him was kind and patient. She explained that what had happened to Danny was not his fault, that predators were experts at manipulation, and that even adults sometimes fell for these tactics. She told him he was helping by coming forward, that the information he provided might help catch this person before he hurt other kids. They took Danny's devices as evidence. The detective explained that they'd extract all the data, trace the IP addresses, and work with federal authorities since online predation cases often crossed state lines. She said it might take weeks or months, but they would do everything possible to identify and locate this person. She also gave us resources, pamphlets about counseling services for children who'd experienced online exploitation, support groups for parents. The next few days were a blur. Sarah took time off work to stay home with Danny. We enrolled him in therapy with a counselor who specialized in trauma and exploitation. We had long conversations about internet safety, about red flags, about the difference between secrets and surprises. Danny opened up more about the experience, about how confused and scared he'd been, about how he'd wanted to tell us but didn't know how. I couldn't stop thinking about how close we'd come to disaster. If I'd been even a little later coming home that Tuesday, if I hadn't heard that voice from Danny's room, if Danny had been better at hiding what was happening, this could have gone on for months. The man could have escalated. The meeting at the park could have been much worse. Danny could have been taken, hurt, traumatized in ways I couldn't even let myself imagine, and I'd grounded him. When my son had been carrying this enormous, terrifying secret, when he'd been threatened and manipulated and scared out of his mind, I'd punished him. I'd taken away his phone, his only potential lifeline. I'd isolated him further, made him feel even more alone. I'd been so focused on teaching him a lesson about honesty that I'd completely missed the real problem. The guilt ate at me. I apologized to Danny over and over. I told him I was sorry for not listening, for not seeing the signs, for not understanding that his lying was a symptom of something much bigger. He forgave me easily, the way kids do, but I couldn't forgive myself. Sarah tried to reassure me, telling me I'd done the right thing once I knew the truth, that I couldn't have known what was really happening. But that didn't make me feel better. I was his father. I was supposed to protect him, and I'd failed. 2 weeks after we reported everything to the police, the detective called with an update. They'd traced the IP address to a location in Pennsylvania. Federal agents had executed a search warrant and arrested a man named Michael Patterson. He was 53 years old, a registered sex offender who'd been convicted of similar crimes 15 years earlier. He'd served his time, been released, and apparently gone right back to his old patterns. When they searched his house, they found multiple devices with evidence of him grooming dozens of children across several states. Danny wasn't his first victim. He wasn't even his 10th. The detective told us that our quick action had likely saved other children from being targeted. She said that because we'd come forward immediately, they'd been able to act fast and gather evidence before Patterson had time to destroy it or go into hiding. That should have made me feel better, but it didn't. Because even though we'd helped catch a predator, even though we'd potentially saved other kids, my son had still been hurt. He'd still been manipulated and threatened. He'd still spent weeks living in fear. And I'd spent a portion of those weeks punishing him for trying to cope with an impossible situation. Danny's therapy sessions continued. His counselor said he was processing the trauma well, that his resilience was remarkable. She credited our immediate response and support for his relatively positive outlook. She said that children who felt believed and protected by their parents tended to recover better from these experiences. But she also warned us that the effects might not be immediate, that trauma could surface in unexpected ways as Danny got older. At school, we worked with the principal and Danny's teachers to put together a safety plan. We didn't tell them the specifics, just that Danny had experienced something traumatic and needed extra support. His teachers were understanding. They kept an eye on him, checked in with him regularly, made sure he felt safe. His friends noticed he seemed quieter, more withdrawn, but Danny wasn't ready to tell them what had happened. That was his choice, and we respected it. Sarah and I attended a support group for parents whose children had been targeted online. It was shocking how common this was. Every parent in that room had a similar story. A child who'd been contacted through a video game, a social media app, a chat forum, predators who'd seemed trustworthy, who'd known exactly what to say to gain access, parents who'd had no idea what was happening until it was almost too late. We learned a lot in those meetings. We learned about parental controls and monitoring software, about the importance of having devices in common areas instead of bedrooms, about keeping communication open so kids felt comfortable reporting uncomfortable interactions. We also learned that even with all the precautions in the world, predators were skilled at finding ways around them. The best protection was education and an open relationship where children felt safe telling their parents anything. I started volunteering with an organization that educated parents about online safety. I spoke at schools and community centers, sharing our story without using Danny's name. I talked about the warning signs, the manipulation tactics, the importance of listening to your children, even when what they're saying doesn't make sense. I talked about how I'd failed to see what was happening, how I'd punished my son for the very behavior that should have alerted me something was wrong. The legal process moved slowly. Patterson was charged with multiple federal crimes, including child exploitation, possession of child pornography, and using the internet to entice a minor. The prosecutor told us Danny might need to testify at trial, but they were going to do everything possible to avoid that. They had enough evidence from the devices from the other victims that Danny's testimony might not be necessary. Sarah and I were relieved. The idea of putting Danny through a trial, of having him face his abuser in court, was almost unbearable. 8 months after we first reported everything, Patterson pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The detective called to let us know, and she said that our case had been instrumental in building a strong prosecution. She said Danny's detailed account and the preserved messages had provided a clear timeline and pattern of grooming that matched what they'd found with other victims. I told Danny about the sentencing. He was quiet for a long time, and then he asked me if that meant the man couldn't hurt any more kids. I told him, yes, that the man would be in prison for a very long time. Danny nodded slowly and said good. Then he asked if he could go outside and play soccer with his friends. I said, of course. I watched from the window as he ran across the yard, chasing the ball, laughing at something one of his friends said. He looked like a normal 12-year-old kid again, at least from the outside. But I knew the truth. I knew that underneath that normal exterior, my son carried scars that might never fully heal. I knew that he'd learned at 12 years old that there were people in the world who wanted to hurt him, who would lie and manipulate and threaten to get what they wanted. I knew that his innocence had been stolen, that his childhood had been marked by fear and confusion and shame, and I knew that I'd made it worse, even if only for a little while. I'd grounded him when he needed support. I'd punished him when he needed protection. I'd valued a lesson about honesty over understanding why my son felt he needed to lie in the first place. I'd been so sure I was doing the right thing, teaching him about consequences and responsibility. I'd been so wrong. Danny is 14 now. 2 years after everything happened. He still goes to therapy every other week. He's doing well in school, has good friends, plays on a competitive soccer team. On the surface, he seems fine, but Sarah and I know better. We see the moments when he gets quiet and withdrawn, when something triggers a memory or a feeling he can't quite name. We see how he's more cautious now, more guarded. He doesn't trust adults as easily. He questions people's motives. He's lost some of the carefree joy that should be a natural part of childhood. We've had to rebuild trust in our relationship too. For a long time after everything came out, Danny was hesitant to tell us things. He'd been burned once, punished for trying to handle a situation he didn't understand. Even though I'd apologized, even though I'd explained that I'd been wrong, the damage had been done. It took months of consistent support and understanding before he started opening up to us again the way he used to. Sarah and I made a lot of changes after that. We set up regular family meetings where everyone could talk about their week, share concerns, ask questions. We established a rule that no one would ever be punished for telling the truth, no matter what the truth was. We told Danny and his younger sister that if they ever felt uncomfortable about something, even if they couldn't explain why, we wanted to know. We promised to listen without judgment, to take their feelings seriously, to prioritize their safety above everything else. We also became more involved in our kids' online lives, but in a balanced way. We didn't want to hover or invade their privacy to the point where they felt they couldn't breathe, but we did require that computers stayed in common areas. We did random spot checks of their messages and social media. We talked regularly about what they were doing online, who they were talking to, what kinds of interactions they were having. We made it clear that these precautions weren't because we didn't trust them, but because we knew the internet could be dangerous. Looking back, I can see all the signs I missed. The nervousness, the secrecy, the fear in Danny's eyes when I grounded him, the way he'd wanted to explain but couldn't find the words, the desperation in his voice when he'd asked if he could tell me the truth. If I'd been less focused on discipline and more focused on understanding, if I'd asked why instead of assuming I knew, I might have uncovered the truth sooner. But I also know I can't torture myself forever with what-ifs. The detective told us that most parents miss the signs. Predators are professionals at deception. They know how to operate in the shadows, how to manipulate both children and families. Even parents who are vigilant, who think they're doing everything right, can miss what's happening right under their noses. The therapist told me something that stuck with me. She said that parenting isn't about being perfect. It's about being present, being willing to learn, being able to admit when you're wrong and change course. She said that what mattered wasn't that I'd initially missed the signs or that I'd grounded Danny. What mattered was that when I finally understood what was happening, I acted immediately. I believed my son. I protected him. I did everything in my power to make it right. I try to hold on to that on the hard days, the days when the guilt threatens to overwhelm me. I remind myself that I did the right thing once I knew the truth. I got Danny help. I worked with the police. I supported him through the therapy and the legal process. I changed our family's approach to communication and safety. I turned our painful experience into something that could help other families avoid the same nightmare. But I also can't forget the look on Danny's face when I told him he was grounded. The fear, the desperation, the knowledge that he was trapped in a situation with no good options. I can't forget the weeks he spent suffering in silence because he was too scared to tell the truth. I can't forget that when my son needed me most, I was too focused on teaching him a lesson to see that he was drowning. The other parents in our support group talk about this too. The guilt, the second guessing, the constant replay of every moment leading up to the discovery. One mother talked about how she'd taken away her daughter's phone for a month because she'd been sneaking it into her room at night. Turns out the daughter had been using it to contact a crisis helpline because she was being sexually harassed by a boy at school. The mother had punished her for trying to get help. Another father talked about grounding his son for skipping school. The son had been skipping because a group of older kids had been waiting for him outside the building, threatening to beat him up if he didn't give them money. The father had been furious about the truancy, hadn't stopped to ask why. By the time he found out the truth, his son had already been assaulted twice. These stories haunt me because they're so similar to mine. Parents who love their children, who are trying to raise them right, who think they're enforcing important rules and teaching valuable lessons, and underneath it all, children who are suffering, who need help, who can't find a way to ask for it. The disconnect between what parents think is happening and what's actually happening can be catastrophic. I've learned that discipline without understanding is just punishment, that consequences without context can do more harm than good, that sometimes when children lie, it's not because they're bad kids who need to be corrected. Sometimes it's because they're scared kids who need to be saved. And as a parent, my job isn't to jump to conclusions or enforce rules blindly. My job is to look deeper, ask questions, and create an environment where my children feel safe telling me the truth, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. Danny and I talk about what happens sometimes. Not often, and never when I bring it up. But every once in a while, he'll mention something from that time. He'll say he understands why I grounded him, that from my perspective, it made sense. He's remarkably mature about it, more mature than he should have to be. But I can also see the shadow that crosses his face when we talk about it, the memory of how alone he felt, how trapped. I've asked him what I could have done differently. He's thought about it and said he wished I'd asked him more questions before jumping to punishment. He wished I'd noticed how scared he was instead of how dishonest. He said that when he'd asked if he could explain, if he could tell me the truth, that was his cry for help. That was the moment he was trying to break through his fear and tell me everything, and I'd shut him down because I was too angry about the lying to hear what he was really saying. That moment replays in my mind more than any other. Danny standing in the hallway, tears in his eyes, asking if he could please explain. And me, self-righteous and certain, telling him the grounding stood, that he'd had his chances to be honest. If I could go back and change one moment in my entire life, it would be that one. I would stop. I would listen. I would hear the fear in his voice and the desperation in his question. I would ask him what was really going on. I would give him the space to tell me the truth. But I can't go back. None of us can. All we can do is move forward, trying to do better with the knowledge we have now. I'm a different parent than I was 2 years ago. More patient, more observant, more willing to dig beneath the surface before making assumptions. I question my instincts more, especially when something feels off. I remind myself that children's behavior is communication, and sometimes we need to work harder to understand what they're trying to tell us. Sarah says I'm too hard on myself, that any parent would have reacted the way I did in that situation. Maybe that's true, but it doesn't make me feel better. Because the fact that any parent might have made the same mistake doesn't change the impact that mistake had on my son. It doesn't erase the weeks he spent terrified and alone. It doesn't undo the damage that was done. what it does do is motivate me to help other parents avoid the same mistake. That's why I keep volunteering, keep speaking, keep sharing our story. Every time I tell it, I hope that somewhere in the audience there's a parent who will hear it and think differently the next time their child lies. A parent who will pause before jumping to punishment and ask themselves if there might be something deeper going on. A parent who will create space for truth instead of demanding it. The organization I volunteer with recently asked me to help develop a workshop for parents about recognizing the signs of online grooming. We put together a presentation that covers the tactics predators use, the warning signs in children's behavior, and the steps parents should take if they suspect something is wrong. We emphasize the importance of approaching children with curiosity and concern rather than anger and judgment. In the workshop, I talk about Danny's case without using his name. I describe how a normal, well-adjusted kid can become secretive and anxious when they're being groomed. I explain how predators isolate children by making them keep secrets, and how that isolation can look like typical teenage rebellion to parents. I share the specific signs I missed, the nervousness and fear and desperation, and how I mistook them for guilt over lying. The response has been overwhelming. After every workshop, at least a dozen parents come up to talk to me. Some share their own stories, their own near misses, or actual tragedies. Others thank me for opening their eyes, for helping them understand their children's behavior in a new way. A few have told me that the workshop prompted them to have important conversations with their kids, conversations that uncovered ongoing abuse or harassment. One mother told me that after attending my workshop, she sat down with her 10-year-old daughter and asked if anyone online had ever made her uncomfortable. The daughter broke down and admitted that a man in a chat forum for her favorite video game had been asking her to meet him in person. The mother contacted police immediately, and they were able to identify and arrest the man before any physical meeting took place. She hugged me with tears in her eyes and thanked me for potentially saving her daughter's life. Those moments make the pain of sharing our story worth it. Every child who is protected, every predator who is caught, every family that is spared the trauma we went through, it all matters. It doesn't erase what happened to Danny, but it gives it meaning. It transforms our nightmare into something that can create positive change. Danny knows I do this volunteer work, and he's told me he thinks it's important. He's even said that maybe when he's older, he might want to share his story directly to help other kids understand that they should always tell a trusted adult if someone online makes them uncomfortable. I told him that would be incredibly brave, but only if he felt ready. His healing has to come first, always. The relationship between Danny and me has grown stronger in some ways because of what we went through. We have a depth of understanding now that we didn't have before. He knows I'll always listen, that I'll always believe him, that his safety is more important to me than any rule or lesson I think I need to teach. And I've learned that my son is stronger and braver than I ever gave him credit for. He survived something traumatic, and he's working every day to heal from it. But there are also ways our relationship will never be the same. There's a wariness in Danny now, a hesitation before he shares certain things. Sometimes I catch him starting to tell me something, then stopping himself, and I wonder if he's remembering what happened last time he tried to tell me a difficult truth. I wonder if he's calculating whether it's worth the risk. And every time I see that hesitation, my heart breaks a little more. His younger sister, Emma, was only 8 when everything happened with Danny. We didn't tell her the details, just that Danny had been going through a hard time and needed extra support. But kids are perceptive, and she picked up on the tension in our house. She became clingier, more anxious about separation from Sarah and me. She started having nightmares about bad people taking her brother away. We got Emma into therapy too, just to help her process the changes in our family dynamic. Her therapist said it was normal for siblings to be affected by trauma, even when they don't know the specifics. Emma has always been close to Danny, and she could sense his pain, even if she didn't understand its source. The therapist worked with her on coping strategies for anxiety and helped her understand that our family was safe and strong. Now Emma is 10, and she's doing well. She and Danny have a good relationship, typical sibling stuff with occasional arguments, but lots of love underneath. We've been careful to maintain some normalcy for her, to make sure she doesn't feel overshadowed by Danny's needs or our vigilance about safety. But we've also been honest with her in age-appropriate ways about internet safety and stranger danger. She knows that not everyone online is who they claim to be, and she knows she can always come to us if something feels wrong. The changes we made to our family after Danny's experience have affected Emma too. She has the same rules about devices in common areas, the same regular check-ins, the same emphasis on open communication. At first, she complained about it, said it wasn't fair that she had to follow rules because of something that happened to Danny, but over time, she's come to accept it as normal. And honestly, I think she feels safer knowing we're paying attention. Our extended family knows what happened, though we were selective about how much detail we shared. My parents were devastated. They kept saying they couldn't believe something like this had happened to their grandson, that they'd never heard of anything like it when they were raising kids. I had to explain that this kind of predation has always existed. It's just evolved with technology. Predators used to lurk in parks and playgrounds. Now they lurk in chat rooms and video games. The danger is the same, just the delivery method has changed. Sarah's sister, the one she was visiting that Friday when everything came to a head, has been incredibly supportive. She has kids around the same age as Danny and Emma, and she took our experience as a wake-up call for her own family. She implemented similar safety measures, had similar conversations. She's thanked us multiple times for being open about what happened, even though it was painful to share. But not everyone in our family has been understanding. Sarah's mother blamed us for not monitoring Danny's internet use closely enough. She said this never would have happened if we'd been paying better attention, if we'd been stricter about technology rules. Her judgment stung, especially because part of me agreed with her. Part of me did blame myself for not being vigilant enough. But Sarah defended us fiercely, pointing out that we'd had reasonable safeguards in place and that predators are professionals at circumventing them. The blame and judgment from others is something I wasn't prepared for. When you share a story like this, people have opinions. Some are supportive and empathetic. Others look for ways you failed, ways they would have done things differently, ways they can convince themselves it could never happen to their family. I understand it. I really do. It's scary to accept that even good parents with good kids can be targeted. It's easier to find fault, to create distance, to say, I would never let that happen to my child. But the truth is, it can happen to anyone. The statistics are staggering. 1 in 5 children will be sexually solicited online. 1 in 7 will receive a sexual solicitation where the solicitor tries to make offline contact. These aren't rare occurrences. They're happening every day in every community to families who think they're being careful and to kids who think they're being smart. The detective who worked on Danny's case told me that most of the families she works with are shocked when they find out what's been happening. They say things like, we had parental controls, and I checked his phone sometimes, and he's a good kid who knows better. And she has to explain that none of those things guarantee safety, that predators are constantly adapting their tactics, that good kids with involved parents are still vulnerable. That's the message I try to convey in my volunteer work. Not that parents should live in constant fear or lock their kids away from technology, but that vigilance needs to be paired with communication. Rules need to be paired with relationships. Monitoring needs to be paired with trust building. Because at the end of the day, the best protection we can give our children is the confidence that they can tell us anything and will respond with love and support instead of anger and punishment. I think about that a lot, about how Danny was scared to tell me because he thought he'd be in trouble. And I proved him right, at least initially, by grounding him for lying. I reinforced his fear that honesty would be punished. If our relationship had been different, if I'd established earlier and more clearly that truth was always safe with me, maybe he would have come to me sooner. Maybe he would have told me about Coach Mike, 47, the first time something felt off, instead of waiting until he was desperate and cornered. That's on me. That's my failure as a parent. Not that I didn't know a predator was contacting my son through a video game, but that my son didn't feel safe enough to tell me when he realized something was wrong. That's the piece that haunts me, the piece I'm still working to fix. Because it doesn't matter how many safety measures you put in place if your child doesn't trust you enough to use them. Sarah and I have worked hard to rebuild that trust, not just with Danny, but as a foundation for our entire family. We've had to examine our parenting styles, our communication patterns, our default responses to problems. We've had to admit where we fell short and commit to doing better. It's been humbling and painful and necessary. One thing we changed was our approach to discipline in general. We used to be fairly strict, consequences-oriented parents. Break a rule, face a consequence. It seems straightforward. But we've learned that not all rule breaking is created equal, and not all consequences are appropriate. Now we try to understand the why before determining the what. Why did this happen? What need was the child trying to meet? What can we learn from this situation? That doesn't mean we don't have rules or expectations. We do, but we hold them more loosely, with more room for context and conversation, and we've made it explicitly clear that telling us the truth, even about something difficult, will never result in punishment. There might be natural consequences or problem-solving discussions, but never punishment for honesty itself. Danny tested this new approach several times in the months after everything happened. He'd admit to things, small things like forgetting his homework or spending his allowance on something he wasn't supposed to, and then wait to see how we'd react. Each time we thanked him for telling the truth and worked with him to address the situation without anger or punishment. Slowly, gradually, he started to believe that we meant what we said. The same approach has worked with Emma. She's naturally more rule-following than Danny, but she's also seen how we respond to honesty versus hiding. She's learned that truth is valued in our house, that mistakes are opportunities to learn rather than reasons for shame. I hope that foundation will serve her well as she gets older and faces more complex situations. People ask me sometimes if I'm afraid of technology now, if I regret letting Danny use video games and chat features. The answer is complicated. Do I wish none of this had happened? Absolutely. Do I think we should have been more restrictive about online access? Maybe, though I'm not sure it would have made a difference. Predators find ways to reach kids regardless of restrictions. They use the platforms kids have access to, whatever those might be. What I regret more than the technology itself is not teaching Danny sooner about the red flags of grooming, not explaining that adults who want to keep secrets from parents are automatically suspect, not emphasizing that no legitimate coach or mentor would ask for inappropriate photos or pressure a child into secrecy. These are conversations we should have been having from the moment Danny started using the internet. Conversations I thought could wait until he was older. I was wrong. These conversations need to happen early and often, tailored to the child's age and understanding. Even young children can learn basic concepts like privacy, boundaries, and safe adults. As they get older, the conversations can become more specific and nuanced. But waiting until you think they're old enough means you've probably waited too long. That's another thing I emphasize in the workshops I teach. Start the conversations early. Make them ongoing rather than one-time talks. Use news stories or scenarios as teaching moments. Role play what to do if someone online asks for personal information or photos. Make it normal to discuss these topics so kids don't feel ashamed or scared if something does happen, because shame is the weapon predators use most effectively. They make children feel complicit, responsible, guilty. They convince kids that if anyone finds out what's been happening, the child will be blamed and punished. And often, they're not entirely wrong. Society has a tendency to ask victims what they did wrong, why they didn't say no, why they didn't tell someone sooner. We place responsibility on the victim rather than the perpetrator. I did that to Danny, at least initially. When he told me about the pictures he'd sent, my first internal reaction was, why would you do that? It took conscious effort to push past that instinct and remember that he was a child. He'd been manipulated by an adult expert in manipulation, and none of this was his fault. But that initial instinct, that impulse to blame the victim, it's deeply ingrained in our culture. We have to actively fight against it. Danny's therapist has talked to us about this too. She said one of the most important things we did right, once we knew the truth, was to make it clear to Danny that he was not to blame. We never asked why he'd sent the photos or agreed to meet the man. We never suggested he should have known better or been more careful. We focused entirely on the fact that an adult had taken advantage of him, and that was the only wrong that mattered. She said that many children who experience online exploitation carry guilt and shame for years because the adults around them, even well-meaning adults, subtly communicate that the child should have prevented what happened. Questions like, didn't you know that was dangerous, or why didn't you tell me sooner, even when asked with concern rather than accusation, can reinforce a child's belief that they're somehow responsible. We've tried to be so careful about that with Danny. We've told him repeatedly that the only person who did anything wrong was Michael Patterson. We've praised him for eventually finding the courage to tell us. We've acknowledged how difficult and scary the situation was. We've never, not even once, suggested that he could have or should have done anything differently. I think that's helped his recovery. His therapist says he's processing the trauma in a healthy way, that he's not showing signs of the deep-seated shame and self-blame that often accompany these experiences. He still has struggles, still has moments of anxiety or fear, but he doesn't seem to carry the burden of feeling responsible for what happened to him. The arrest and conviction of Michael Patterson brought some closure, but not as much as I'd hoped. Knowing he was in prison, unable to hurt other children, was important, but it didn't erase what had happened. It didn't give Danny back the innocence he'd lost or the weeks he'd spent living in fear. Justice, such as it was, couldn't undo the damage. What has helped more than the legal outcome is seeing Danny heal and grow, watching him regain his confidence, reconnect with his friends, find joy in activities he loves, seeing him laugh at a stupid joke or get excited about a soccer game or argue with his sister over whose turn it is to pick the movie. These normal, everyday moments are the real victory. They're proof that Patterson didn't break my son, that Danny is more than what happened to him. But I also know the journey isn't over. Trauma doesn't work on a linear timeline. Danny might have years where he seems completely fine, and then something might trigger a memory or a feeling, and he'll struggle again. His therapist has prepared us for this, told us that healing isn't about getting back to how things were before. It's about integrating the experience, learning to live with it, building resilience and coping skills. As a parent, that's hard to accept. I want to fix it. I want to make it all better. I want to turn back time and prevent it from happening in the first place. But I can't do any of those things. All I can do is be present, be supportive, be the father Danny needs me to be right now. Not the father I think I should be, or the father I wish I'd been back then. Just present, in this moment, doing my best. That's what I tell other parents too. You can't change the past, but you can learn from it. You can't guarantee your child will never be hurt, but you can create an environment where they feel safe telling you when they are. You can't control everything in your child's life, but you can control how you respond when things go wrong. And when you do make mistakes, because you will, you can acknowledge them, you can apologize, you can change your behavior going forward, you can model the kind of accountability and growth you want to see in your children. That's been one of the unexpected gifts of this experience. Danny has seen me admit I was wrong. He's seen me struggle with guilt and work to do better. He's seen that adults don't have all the answers, that we mess up too, and that what matters is how we handle our mistakes. I hope that lesson serves him well as he grows up. I hope he internalizes that making mistakes, even serious ones, doesn't make you a bad person. What makes you a good person is acknowledging your mistakes, learning from them, and doing better next time. That's a lesson I'm still learning myself every single day. Looking at where we are now, 2 years later, I can see both how far we've come and how much further we still have to go. Our family is stronger in some ways, more communicative and connected, but we're also marked by what happened, changed in ways both visible and invisible. Danny carries scars. Sarah and I carry guilt. Emma carries the anxiety of having sent something wrong, even if she didn't understand what it was. We're not the family we were before, and we never will be again. But we're learning to be okay with that. We're learning that families don't have to be perfect to be strong. That love doesn't mean the absence of mistakes. It means continuing to show up and try even after you've failed. That healing doesn't mean forgetting or erasing what happened. It means finding a way to move forward while carrying the weight of the past. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to immediately contact law enforcement and lift Danny's grounding the moment I learned the truth, because this decision didn't just protect my son, it led to the arrest of a serial predator, helped identify dozens of other victims, and potentially saved countless children from the same nightmare we lived through. But it also meant our family had to go through a lengthy investigation. Danny had to relive his trauma multiple times in police interviews, and we all had to accept that our story would become part of a larger legal case. Some people have told me I should have waited, consulted a lawyer first, protected Danny's privacy more carefully. Others have said I didn't act fast enough, that I should have figured out what was happening sooner. And I'm left wondering if there was a perfect way to handle an impossible situation, or if I just did the best I could with the information I had at the time. So please tell me in the comments if I was right or wrong, because even now, 2 years later, I still lie awake at night replaying every decision and wondering if I could have done something differently.